On July 7, 1935, in Brooklyn, Catherine Susan Genovese gave birth to Kitty Genovese. Italian-American parents Vincent Genovese and Rachel Petrocelli were her parents. Vincent, her father, owned and operated a business named Bay Ridge Curt and Apron Supply. Additionally, Kitty's mother, Rachel, was a stay-at-home mom who raised Kitty and her 4 younger Vin siblings, Frank, Bill, and Susan. Kitty was characterized as an active young girl who truly faced life head-on when she was younger. She attended Prospect Heights High School, an all-girls institution, where she graduated in 1953 with a passion for English, music, and education. And then her mother actually saw a murder when she graduated from high school at the age of roughly 18. And she was genuinely afraid by this. It really caused her to relocate to New Canaan, a town in Connecticut on New Canaan. I'm not sure. It is accurate. I wasn't present. Anyway, since Kitty cherished New York, she chose not to accompany them. She cherished the way of life. It happened quickly. It was thrilling. There were countless chances and individuals to interact with. Thus, she remained in Brooklyn and briefly resided with her grandparents before getting married to rock musician Father Laurie, a military cadet, in 1954, and within a year they got divorced and had their marriage revoked. For the following 4 years, Kitty spent most of her time in New York, working various jobs, with occasional weekend trips to see her family in Connecticut. She held positions as a barmaid, waitress, hostess, and secretary. In addition, she ran a sports betting business where she essentially served as a bookmaker and let customers place bets on horse races while she worked as a mother. She was also earning a respectable living from this. In today's currency, she was earning almost $7,000 a month doing that. However, she actually lost her job and was arrested for bookmaking in 1961. She did, however, recover rapidly. She was a very diligent worker at Eve's 11th Hour Tavern in Queens, where she was able to secure a position as manager. She frequently took on 2 shifts in order to earn money for her ambition of one day owning her own Italian restaurant. Finally, in 1963, Kitty started dating a woman by the name of Mary Ann. They have a lengthy history of meeting at a hidden tavern. They actually moved in together after they instantly clicked. That Samia into a Queens flat near the intersection of Austin Street and Kew Gardens. And even 50 years later, Mary Ann reminisced about her happiest days in a conversation about this time in her life, the one when she moved in with Kitty. It's crazy to consider that at the time, it was against the law to be in a same-sex relationship in New York, so they had to keep their connection somewhat under wraps. You couldn't just be with the person you wanted to be with or love the person you wanted to love. Additionally, that was against the law. It is also really shameful that it is still prohibited in some parts of the world today. However, Kitty chose not to disclose her relationship with Mary to her family as a result. And she said, "I believe there are a few friends and co-workers at the bar, but that was all." They were largely forced to keep it secret. However, in 1963, Kitty was in love and everything was going so beautifully for her. She and her partner had recently moved into a new apartment. She was bringing in money. Her goal was to build an Italian restaurant, so she was saving money for that. Unfortunately, though, it was short-lived. And in 1964, everything was different. It was actually Kitty and Mary's first anniversary on March 13th. Kitty had left. She was moving quite slowly, and I believe she didn't leave the pub until around 2:30 in the morning. When she finally did go, though, it was because she could not wait to see Mary Ann and, celebrate their anniversary. She arrived home at approximately 3:15 a.m., and she parked in the railroad station's lot, which is almost right next to her apartment. I estimate that the distance from this parking lot to her front door is less than 100 feet. However, she kind of noticed this man there when she stepped out of the car, and it startled her. Hence, she chose to walk up Austin Street toward this coal box that led directly to the 1 or 2 police precinct rather than walking the 100 feet straight to her flat. However, a man approached her as she was heading to the cold box and gave her 2 or 3 back stab wounds with a hunting knife that was serrated. It was hard and so amazing. It seemed as though this attack had no pattern or purpose until it happened. She exclaimed, "Oh God, I've been stabbed," as she wailed. "Please, please, please, please assist me." And she let out this kind of terrifying scream that kind of echoed across the neighborhood, frightening a lot of the locals. Still, nobody took any action. It was also quite dark. It was chilly. Many others had their windows closed, so it's possible that they were unable to hear the scream as well. Those who heard it kind of went to look out their window because it was getting dark. I suppose that's why they say they didn't see much. I did hear the attack, according to Robert Morris, a neighbor across the street. He perceived the situation somewhat and thought it was just a couple arguing, I think. But he witnessed the assault. After witnessing Kitty being stabbed, he called at the assailant to leave the area via his window. And that was sufficient to frighten off Kitty's assailant. Kitty, though, was bleeding already. She was bleeding quickly, and at this time she was barely hanging on. And when this Robert person called out, he simply kind of went back to bed without doing anything else. Joseph Fink, the night elevator operator, witnessed the entire attack, just as he saw Kitty get stabbed. And he appears to be able to sit it down and get his baseball bat. However, he reasoned that it would be preferable if he let her die outside while going upstairs to take a nap, and he carried out that exact action. Kitty was left to bleed to death and survive on her own. Despite her severe injuries, she was able to drag herself into her neighbor's apartment building and fell to the ground after entering the foyer. By now she was just hanging on, barely hanging on, but she was still alive. She required immediate medical assistance, yet nobody took action. The majority of those who witnessed the assault or heard her screams assumed it was just a couple fighting. Thus, they were reluctant to step in. Before Kitty reached the fire, a woman by the name of Heidi did witness her bleeding out like a lion on the side of the road. Furthermore, she was oblivious to her serious injuries. Thus, she took no action. At this point, I think someone did actually contact the cops, but they kind of turned it off. As Kitty is bleeding out in the foyer, the assailant has fled. He has actually only raced to his car. After waiting for 10 minutes or so, he discovers that no one has come to Kitty's rescue. Nobody has made a police call. There's no police presence. He then makes the decision to go out for a second round. I don't even get how changing his hat helps him hide his identity. That's all he does. It just makes me think of that one moment in the Batman movies where the Joker shows up while Harvey Dent is in the hospital. Harvey doesn't recognize him since he has, like, the little merely the massive goes out of your mouth. Subsequently, the Joker removes his mask, and Harvey becomes extremely alarmed upon realizing it's him. With all the face paint all over him, I suppose he wouldn't have recognized him while wearing the mask and would have said, "Here she is." He says, "Oh my God, it gives me those lives after that." In any case, Kitty is trying to defend herself when the assailant discovers her in the foyer and just begins slicing and stabbing her. She seems to be trying to defend each of us since she is essentially helpless. Her hands are all that she has. She's wearing leather gloves, yet they merely fall off of her as she tries to defend herself by holding her hands up. After raping Kitty and stealing $49 from her wallet, this man simply flees. During this time, Kitty was undoubtedly also screaming both in anguish and for help because she was still alive in spite of everything that had happened to her and her injuries. She was alive, even though her breathing was labored. In fact, Carl Ross, Kitty's neighbor, was able to hear all of her screams. You know, he was too terrified to look out of his window and observe what was happening when the screams were coming. After a while, the sound seemed to have stopped. He then slightly cracked up his door and peered outside to see Kitty bleeding from her assailant in the entryway. And Kitty staring at him as if to establish eye contact with Carl. The assailant then does the same. Carl then kind of freaks out. He shuts his door and takes no action. Not even the cops are called by him. Rather than calling the police, he makes a call to his girlfriend, who tells him not to get involved. He then does nothing to assist his friend, whom he had just witnessed being attacked in the foyer, thinking that perhaps now he might understand. I'm not going to go out there and start fighting with a man who has a knife, but at the very least give the police a call. In any case, nurses begin to disseminate the word about what happened when the attack ends and the assailant flees. Yes, so this guy named Carl really broke through his window and went into his neighbor's apartment to ask for guidance on what to do and all that kind of stuff. I suppose that after that, word of what had happened just began to get out among the residents of Kew Gardens and all of the flats. And one of Kitty's pals, Sophie Farrar, is the one to whom the news eventually gets. Since her husband and kid weren't there, she could actually hear Kitty's screams, but they were kind of unaware of what was going on. They tried to return to their bed after looking out of their window and seeing nothing, not knowing what was going on. But without hesitation, she rushed out into the nightclub foyer as soon as she learned what had happened and that Kitty had been attacked and stabbed. Furthermore, she had no idea whether the attacker was still present or not. She hurried over to console Kitty right away. In the foyer, she discovered Kitty. Kitty was speechless, and there was blood all over the place. Her breathing was labored. She resembled gushing blood. Sophie simply embraced her with her arms. Kitty was acting as though her assailant was still there as she was firing and defending herself. It was as though she had simply gone too far to comprehend that her friend was now consoling her rather than attacking her. Now, this was in 1963, correct? Thus, there were no cell phones. By now, there was no 911. Thus, you had to use your house phone to contact your local police officer or police station in order to report a crime. And it took someone 30 minutes to act upon this. Carl Ross was the one. Can you believe it took him so long to call the police? He observed what was going on, but he was like, okay, I understand not going armed with a knife attacker. He had so much more time to call the cops. He had the option to contact the police right away. I don't understand why it took so long for someone to call the police. This is attributed by many psychologists to the bystander effect. However, if I were among 100 people and witnessed someone being stabbed, I would undoubtedly be among the 100 who called the police. The police can be contacted by about 100 people. It's not necessary to just sit there and think, oh well, maybe someone else will. Imagine if all 100 of you dialed 911. I'm not sure I get it. You genuinely witnessed someone being stabbed and your reaction was, oh, I'm not sure, I have no desire to become involved. She's literally bleeding in the foyer. I suppose I should wait 30 minutes to see what happens, and then I might, call the police. It's beyond me. Given that the ambulance didn't arrive until 4:15 a.m., Kitty and Sophie must have felt as though it had been a lifetime. It was already too late when they finally arrived. Katie was clearly rushed to the hospital right away, but she was unable to arrive. She was just 28 years old when she died, thus she died before she could arrive. Since the ambulance didn't arrive until approximately 4:15, Kitty was battling for her life for approximately an hour before she died. The two attacks lasted for roughly 30 minutes each. That is 1 hour that may have been used for other purposes. An investigation into the incident could have started almost immediately if someone had recognized her body at the morgue, notified the police, or her girlfriend Mary. Thus, they started by questioning suspects and witnesses. And of course, Marianne, Kitty's girlfriend, was among the first individuals they interviewed. Her arrival was at 7 in the morning for her interview, and she was questioned for almost 6 hours later that day by homicide detectives in addition to being quizzed by a detective called Mitchell Sang. Furthermore, Mary was questioned extensively about her relationship with Kitty. Furthermore, since Marianne and Kitty were involved in a same-sex relationship which was against the law at the time, many inquiries pertaining to their relationship were posed to other witnesses, neighbors, and acquaintances. And when a same-sex pair committed a murder like this, envy was thought to be the motivation, more so than if a man and woman couple committed the same crime, which is absurd. Fortunately, Marianne's status as a suspect was immediately withdrawn. Thus, on March 19th, 6 days later, a man by the name of Winston Mosley was captured in relation to a robbery that had taken place at RSN Park. And this is what happened. Ralph Cleary, a local, spotted Winston hauling a TV set out of a neighbor's house, which made Rule suspicious. When Ralph asked Winston what he was doing, Winston told him he was a removalist, which was insufficient justification. Winston proceeded to speak with the neighbors, who verified that the occupants of the flat where Winston was removing the TV were not indeed relocating. Rao then called the police and damaged Winston's vehicle to prevent him from escaping with the TV before the cops showed up. I'm not sure if he was being restrained by anyone. That's the only explanation I can think of for why he didn't simply run away, even though I didn't find anything about it in my study. Nevertheless, witnesses claim to have seen a similar white automobile the night of Kitty's murder, so when the police arrive and arrest him, they kind of immediately begin to suspect that this might be the person responsible for Kitty's death. Winston, who was 29 years old at the time of his arrest, was questioned and ultimately confessed to the murder and sexual abuse of Kitty, as well as 2 other women, Annie Mae Johnson and Barbara Keller. In addition, he acknowledged having committed between 30 and 40 break-ins. Winston was employed at Remington Rand as a tab operator, punching data cards. Moreover, this was a well-paying position that called for a high degree of intelligence. He lived with his wife in South Ozone Park, another neighborhood in Queens, and was the father of 3 children. He was also a bright guy. He was said to be soft-spoken, and to have had an IQ of 135. The night he married Kitty, he had left his family at home. He simply abandoned them as he set out to find another person to kill and molest. I can't even begin to conceive your dad or your spouse thinking that when they're out strolling or doing anything else, they're out raping and murdering someone. I mean, I just can't imagine finding out. He therefore says that he only singled out Kitty for attention because it was convenient for him, that is, he saw her as she was walking home from work. A red light had stopped her. That's when he made the decision to drive his automobile to follow her home. He did, as I mentioned, acknowledge two other things during the conversation. Thus, this was not his maiden voyage. For him, this pursuit felt almost like a ritual. A psychological evaluation conducted after his detention revealed that he was a necker foul. However, that is essentially the core of the issue, as well as the inquiry. He admitted to it fairly immediately, thus the case was effectively concluded. Thus, 3 months after the murder, on June 8th of that year, Winston's trial got underway. Judge J. is presiding over the case. Kitty's family was unable to bear the pain of going to the trial, so they chose not to attend. Mosley was charged with Kitty's murder, but he was not prosecuted with the other 2 killings that he had confessed to. Furthermore, in the case of Barbara Crooks, no charges or trial were brought against him since Alan Mitchell, a different guy, came forward and admitted to the murder in question. Furthermore, there just wasn't enough evidence in the Annie Mae Johnson case to prosecute Winston or bring him to trial for it. Winston first entered a not guilty plea in relation to Kitty's case, but he later changed this on the advice of his defense lawyer. Instead, he entered a not guilty by reason of insanity plea. He was unable to enter an insanity plea, nevertheless, because it was determined during the trial that he was competent. Winston testified during the trial, detailing both the murder of Kitty and the other 2 killings for which he was not charged. And of the 38 witnesses who were due to testify during this trial, only 5 actually did so. Among these 5 witnesses were the 2 previously mentioned witnesses, Sophie Farah and Robert Mazur. Following 3 days of trial and 7 hours of discussion, the jury returned a guilty verdict for Winston. Winston Mosley was found guilty of Kitty Genovese's murder and given the death penalty 4 days later, on June 15th. Quote, "I don't believe in capital punishment, but I wouldn't hesitate to pull the switch out myself when I see a monster like this," was stated by the judge. However, on June 4, 1967, nearly 3 years later, the New York Court of Appeals determined that Winston was entitled to claim he was medically insane, and as a result, his sentence was commuted from death to life in prison. This is where the case kind of takes a strange turn. To be honest, it looks like a scene from a movie. I promise you that this cannot be revealed so soon. Winston was being transferred from the hospital back to the prison after needing a minor operation for an injury he had caused himself the year following sentencing, the trial, and everything. He struck the officer carrying him during the ride, grabbed his gun, and ran away to a nearby abandoned house. The owner's 3-day absence was the only reason the residence was unoccupied. Yes, when they returned 3 days after everything that transpired, Winston holds them captive for more than an hour. He writes, Mrs. Kulaoff then takes off with their car and runs away. He takes a car to Grand Island, where he holds a mother and her daughter hostage after breaking into another home. Fortunately, he manages to free her and her daughter without any harm after roughly 2 hours. Additionally, he turns himself in to the FBI. Before he was charged with escape and kidnapping, he had been evading capture for around 4 days. Additionally, he received 2 additional 15-year sentences, which were mandated to be served concurrently with his life term, after entering a guilty plea. Winston eventually qualified for parole in 1984, and he attempted to portray himself as the victim at his initial parole hearing because of the publicity surrounding his conviction and trial. He also attempted to claim that it was only intended to be a mugging and that he had no intention of killing Kitty. Then he remarked, quietly, that when people mug others, they really do kill them. On occasion, evidently parole was not granted to him, and I believe that the reason for this was that he exhibited absolutely no regret for any of his deeds. Even though I don't think he was ever going to be granted parole, I believe that things would have turned out better for him if he had at least entered the facility and expressed regret for his actions. I'm a different person now. Rather than going in there and saying, this is unfair because a lot of people have heard about my case now and all the embarrassing things I've done, and occasionally muggings result in fatalities. How do I put it? As I previously stated, Kitty's family was not present at the initial trial, so they were genuinely unaware of all the specifics of what transpired and what Winston had done to her until 1995, when they attended his retrial. And at that point, they genuinely learned every aspect of what had transpired. Until his death in 2016, Winston was one of the longest-serving prisoners in New York, having had 18 parole hearings, all of which were denied. It is unlikely that this story is primarily about Winston, his trial, his incarceration, or the investigation at 81 years old, having served 52 years in prison. It has more to do with how the media covered this story and sensationalized the case, a topic we'll discuss in a moment. Additionally, it addresses the fact that, within a sizable population, very few will take meaningful action in response to a challenging circumstance. In terms of media coverage, the incident was largely ignored for around 2 weeks at first, and then the New York Times released a story on it 2 weeks later. It was published by a reporter by the name of Martin Ginsburg, who essentially stated that 38 witnesses observed everything that occurred, but none of them phoned the police or offered any assistance. Since the publication of this article, it has been apparent that several significant mistakes were present. The New York Times itself acknowledged that they had published this report incorrectly and that it had been greatly inflated. The problem is, it's difficult to determine how exaggerated it was at this point. These days, it's very difficult to determine the actual facts, the number of witnesses, the extent to which witnesses saw what, and how many of them saw it, and the number of people who actually took action, such as trying to contact the police or anything similar. The majority of witnesses assert that they saw nothing. All witnesses assert that they saw nothing at all, and if any witnesses did see something, it was only a small amount. They were unable to interpret what they were seeing. They believed it to be nothing more than a drunken lover's quarrel between a husband and wife, but I should probably take all of this with a grain of salt since, of course, nobody is going to come out and say, yeah, I saw her get angry and get stabbed. I did nothing when I watched her bleeding out. Saying, yeah, I didn't really understand what I was seeing is so much simpler. I was either completely blind to what was happening or didn't see it at all. Nobody wants to be perceived as this callous individual. Furthermore, many witnesses stated that they did call the police, but who is telling the truth? Who is lying, the police claiming they didn't get the calls, or the witnesses claiming they phoned the police? It is true that we will never be able to determine the whole number of witnesses who were actually injured. What now? What was done by whom? And the reason for this is that the media has sensationalized this subject and has only published things that align with their agenda. The news that Sophie Farrar had been there and had shown Kitty compassion in her final moments had not spread widely for a very long time. For a very long time, not even Kitty's family knew that someone was there to soothe and embrace her. A police report written by Danny Mann actually found a number of errors in the New York Times piece shortly after it was published, which is how Kitty passed away. Thus, he proceeded and faced Mann, the article's author. He essentially challenged him, why did you not disclose the fact that many of these witnesses were unaware of what they were seeing? Mann basically said, well, that's going to ruin the story in response. And Danny took no action in response. He didn't make this known. He didn't want to cause a rift, so he didn't, try to have the item fixed. He did not want to put his own career at danger. The media only kept sensationalizing the tale as a result. They went on to report it falsely, which is absurd because psychological studies frequently cite this instance as a historic one since it is largely credited with the discovery of the bystander effect and the coining of the term bystander effect. And because of the media's reporting on this case and how they presented it, all of these psychological research on it would be rife with errors. We'll never be able to determine the full facts of this case, nor how many individuals saw it and how many didn't. We are aware that several of the witnesses are unquestionably not like Joseph Fink. As I previously indicated, the security guard for the night elevator observed everything that was going on, including the stabbing and mounting of the woman, and he responded, "Oh, I'm actually going to go have a nap instead." Naturally, Carl Ross then peered out his door, witnessed the murder, looked up at Kitty, noticed the assailant, and did nothing. As I previously stated, I can understand not going down there and confronting the man brandishing a knife, but he waited another half hour to call the police following the incident. However, I believe that the entire circumstance involving these witnesses raises the question of what accountability a bystander has in the event that they observe a crime of this nature. Thus, in situations such as these, which are clearly instances in which the bystander effect is relevant, sometimes it's referred to as the Genovese syndrome. As you are all aware, the bystander effect occurs when a large number of people witness something and hope that someone else will take action. Therefore, I don't have to, and no action is taken. And Kitty's situation is actually the first time this bystander effect hypothesis has been applied to a specific individual. Psychologists found it fascinating to investigate this and learn why individuals are less inclined to step in when there are numerous witnesses to a crime. And a great deal of research has been done in an attempt to understand this since 1964. It is an actual occurrence. And these two guys, John, Emily, and Barb Letourneau, are in charge of carrying out a large portion of the research. They started out by looking at a concept they call the diffusion of responsibility. In order to evaluate bystander behavior in emergency situations, they jointly carried out 3 experiments. In their initial trial, 3 distinct rooms were set up, and arbitrary individuals were paired off either with 3 strangers or with 2 other strangers. After completing a questionnaire, smoke was poured into each of the rooms. The purpose of this was to ascertain the number of individuals who would report that smoke was entering the room. When placed in a room by themselves, 75% of the subjects reported smoking. When 2 strangers were placed in a room together, only 38% of the participants said they were intelligent. Furthermore, just 10% of the subjects who were placed in a room with 3 strangers complained about the study's smoke. They definitely came to the conclusion that people are more prone to act when they are concerned. And out of this came the spread of accountability, which gave rise to bias and consequence. It can also be described as analogous to a school group project. Consequently, it goes without saying that you have to handle all of the labor yourself when you're alone. However, you'll discover that most people don't contribute anything to this product when working on a group project. They actually become incredibly indolent. And there's one person who sort of carries the entire group, and the reason for this is that everyone who does nothing feels like their responsibility is diminished because it's shared by so many others. There have been many instances of the bystander effect since the 1960s. One of the most notable ones occurred in 2019, when 16-year-old Kason Morris was fatally stabbed. Numerous witnesses saw the incident, but none took action. Some of the witnesses even went so far as to record a scene on camera in order to share it on Chinese social media. In reality, Wang Yiyu, then 2 years old, was struck by 2 different cars and left for dead in the middle of the road in that particular case. 18 people walked by, ducked around her body, and continued on their way without stopping to see how she was doing or to offer assistance in calling the police. Nothing. Her age was 2 years old. She would pass away 8 days later, but eventually help would arrive. A 2014 study revealed that people are less likely to step in during an emergency if there are more people present. You have undoubtedly encountered the bystander effect at some point in your life, whether it was from being the victim of cyberbullying in a large online forum, or from seeing bullying occur in person at school or on the playground, or from seeing someone being harassed or subjected to sexual harassment in public, or from seeing someone in the public medical emergency room. Furthermore, not many people will step in to help because there are so many people in the area. I have even personally encountered this. I had a lot of people posting about me online when I first started my YouTube channel. I still remember one girl who stood up for me. She posted about me on Facebook and Instagram. It resembled a past regarding me. It was something like hundreds of likes and hundreds of comments, and one girl in particular stood out to me as she left a comment on this post. Thus, it seems to be cases such as these. Additionally, learning about the bystander effect and the impact of bias cases increases your awareness. It encourages you to pay closer attention to your surroundings. Things are happening, you can't just wait for the others who are also witnessing the same things to take action since, more often than not, they are in similar situations to your own. As soon as they realize this, they assume someone else will take action. And for that reason, I believe it's crucial to discuss this case because Kitty was involved in the attack right up until the police were called. That amounted to almost an hour of inaction. Nothing was done, no one called the authorities. I think everyone could just be more conscious. All of us need to simply be more proactive and refrain from calling the police or even getting involved. When you witness something, when you come to someone's rescue, when you witness something like those girls, when you're at a club and you see a woman who seems really uncomfortable with a guy and another girl approaches her and asks, "Hey, are you coming?" and attempt to rescue her from that predicament? Even that basic of an item. And for that reason, I think it's crucial to have a conversation about this case, as we can all be guilty of adopting a bystander mindset. Additionally, I believe that in circumstances like these, it's critical to be more vigilant and proactive. Don't wait for others to take action on your behalf. Even if you don't have to get involved, make contact with someone, the police, the authorities, or somebody else. Another example would be if you saw a girl in a bar or club being harassed by a guy and another girl would approach her and ask, "Hey, are you coming?" That "we've got to go now" feeling. Don't wait for someone else to take that action. We can't just expect someone else to step in and stop someone who is being harassed or yelled at on the train or in public. Because of the bystander effect, sometimes we have to be the change. For Kitty's family, I believe it would only make matters worse. The attacker might not have returned, might have stayed at his car for 10 minutes, and might not have realized that Kitty might have been saved if someone had gone down to check on her after the initial attack. I can't even begin to imagine how devastating it would be for them to even know that there was a chance. No one made a police call. No officers were en route. That's when he made his second visit. Not only did they have to hear about it, but Kitty's family would have suffered greatly from the sensationalized media reports surrounding her death. Because it improved the story, the journalist who covered the New York Times article knew he was sensationalizing the story and that he was leaving out crucial details, but he didn't care. Because they continue to do it, it's extremely annoying and makes you wonder what's wrong with the media. Furthermore, I wanted to mention a small point that I really felt was worth mentioning. Bill, Kitty's brother, received a letter from Winston Moseley more than 50 years after her mother did, in which he essentially stated that he wasn't the true issue. Dominic was the name of the Italian mafia. Winston was merely a tiny getaway driver at this point. Furthermore, I find it intriguing that he wrote this letter more than 50 years later and believed that anyone would find it credible.